Officer Mark Holloway patrolled the quiet streets of Westford, his routine as predictable as the fading daylight. But fate had other plans on this rainy evening. When he spotted a small figure huddled at a lonely bus stop, he had no idea of the profound impact this moment would have. What was this little black girl doing alone at a bus stop in the pouring rain, clutching a pair of yellow high heels like a lifeline? And what secrets lay hidden behind those tear-filled eyes? Let's find out. But before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this heartwarming story, don't forget to subscribe. Ashmore Street, usually bustling with activity, was eerily silent, save for the gentle patter of raindrops on the pavement. At a lonely bus stop, a solitary figure sat hunched over, a stark contrast to the grey surroundings. Officer Mark Holloway's patrol car crawled down the street, his eyes scanning the area out of habit. He'd been on the force for over 2 decades now, and his instincts were as sharp as ever. As he approached the bus stop, something caught his eye, a small form huddled on the ground, barely visible through the misty rain. Holloway slowed the car to a crawl, peering through the windshield. His heart skipped a beat as he realized it was a child, a little girl, no more than 9 or 10 years old. She sat on the cold, wet ground, her knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. Her pink dress was dirty and disheveled, a stark contrast to the pristine yellow high heels she clutched tightly to her chest. The sight stirred something deep within Holloway. For a moment he was transported back in time, to a night that had changed his life forever. The night he'd lost everything that mattered to him, his wife and daughter, consumed by a merciless fire while he was on patrol. The guilt and pain of that night had never truly left him, lurking beneath the surface of his gruff exterior. Shaking off the painful memories, Holloway pulled the car over to the curb. He sat for a moment, observing the girl through the rearview mirror. She hadn't moved, seemingly oblivious to the world around her. The yellow shoes in her grasp stood out like a beacon against the dreary backdrop. Holloway's mind raced with possibilities. Was she a runaway? Had something happened to her family? The protective instinct that had made him such a good officer, and once upon a time a loving father, kicked into high gear. He watched as a tear rolled down her cheek, mixing with the raindrops on her face. The sight tugged at his heart, reminding him painfully of his own daughter. He could almost see little Emma sitting there instead, scared and alone. The memory threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it back, focusing on the task at hand. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Holloway kept expecting someone, a parent, a guardian, anyone, to come running up, frantic with worry over their missing child. But the street remained empty, the only movement coming from the occasional car passing by, their occupants oblivious to the drama unfolding at the bus stop. As time passed, Holloway's concern grew. The girl hadn't moved an inch, seemingly unaware or uncaring of the rain that continued to soak her to the bone. Her stillness was unnatural for a child her age, speaking of a deep trauma or shock. He found himself studying the yellow shoes she held. They were well worn, the once bright color faded and scuffed. Dance shoes, perhaps, or maybe just a favorite pair of someone special to her. Whatever their significance, it was clear they held immense importance to the girl. The rational part of Holloway's mind told him he should call for backup, or at least report the situation to dispatch. But something held him back. There was a fragility to the scene before him, a delicate balance that he feared might shatter with the arrival of more officers or the sound of sirens. As a light wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that cut through his wet uniform, Holloway made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch any longer. This child needed help, and as much as it terrified him to get involved, to open himself up to the possibility of failing another young life, he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, Officer Holloway steeled himself for what was to come. He had no way of knowing that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the life of this mysterious, silent girl forever. With measured steps he began to approach. Officer Holloway's boots squelched softly on the wet pavement as he made his way towards the bus stop. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Years of experience had taught him how to approach potentially volatile situations, but this felt different. This wasn't just another case. This was a child, alone and vulnerable. As he drew closer, he could hear the girl's soft, irregular breathing. It was the only sound she made, a quiet counterpoint to the steady patter of rain around them. Holloway's heart ached at the sight of her, so small and fragile against the harsh backdrop of the urban landscape. "Hey there," he said softly, stopping a few feet away from her. "I'm Officer Holloway. I just want to make sure you're okay." The girl didn't move, didn't even blink. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point, unseeing. Holloway took another careful step forward. "It's pretty wet out here. How about we find somewhere dry to sit? I bet you're cold." Still no response. The yellow shoes in her grasp seemed to gleam dully in the fading light, a silent testament to whatever story had brought her to this moment. Crouching down to her level, Holloway tried again. "I'm here to help, sweetheart. You're not in any trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." He paused, searching for the right words. "Those are pretty shoes you've got there. Are they special to you?" For the first time there was a flicker of something in the girl's eyes. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. A spark of awareness, perhaps even fear. Encouraged by this small sign, Holloway pressed on gently. "My name's Mark. What's yours?" The girl's grip on the shoes tightened, her knuckles turning white with the effort. Holloway could see her beginning to tremble, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "It's okay," he soothed, keeping his voice low and calm. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I'd really like to help you if I can. Is there someone I can call for you? Your parents, maybe?" At the word parents, something changed in the girl's demeanor. Her breathing quickened, and Holloway could see panic beginning to build in her eyes. Hey, it's all right," he said quickly, realizing he'd inadvertently struck a nerve. "We don't have to talk about that if you don't want to. How about we just get out of this rain, huh? I've got a nice warm car right over there. We could sit in it and dry off a bit. What do you say?" He reached out slowly, intending to offer a comforting touch on her shoulder. But before his hand could make contact, the girl's eyes widened in terror. In a flash, she was on her feet. Before Holloway could react, she darted past him, her bare feet splashing through puddles as she ran across the street. "Wait!" Holloway called out, his heart racing as he watched her small form disappearing into the misty rain. "It's not safe." But his words fell on deaf ears. The girl was running as if her life depended on it, clutching those yellow shoes to her chest like a lifeline. For a split second, Holloway hesitated. The memory of his own daughter, lost forever because he wasn't there, threatened to paralyze him. But then his training kicked in, overriding his personal fears. With a burst of speed, Officer Holloway took off after the girl. He couldn't let her disappear into the night. He couldn't fail another child. As he ran, following the fleeting glimpses of pink through the rain, Holloway sent up a silent prayer. He didn't know what had happened to this girl or why she was so afraid, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The pounding of feet on wet pavement gave way to the soft crunch of leaves and twigs as Officer Holloway followed the girl into the forest that bordered the neighborhood. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the already dim light, casting everything in shadows. Holloway's breath came in short gasps as he pushed himself to keep up with the surprisingly swift child. His uniform, heavy with rain, clung to his body, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His entire focus was on the flash of pink that darted between the trees ahead of him. As he ran, Holloway reached for his radio, knowing he needed to call for backup. He couldn't risk losing the girl in the dense forest. "Dispatch, this is Officer Holloway," he panted into the radio. "I'm in pursuit of a young girl, possibly a runaway, heading into the woods near Ashmore Street, requesting backup in case she disappears deeper into the forest." "Copy that, Officer Holloway," came the crackling response. "Backup is on its way." "Please stop," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet forest. "I'm not going to hurt you." But the girl showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, she seemed to run faster, her bare feet somehow finding purchase on the slippery forest floor. Suddenly, Holloway lost sight of her. He slowed his pace, eyes darting around frantically, searching for any sign of movement. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the only sound his own labored breathing and the distant patter of rain on leaves. "Hello?" he called out, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay, you can come out. I just want to help you." A faint rustling to his left caught his attention. Turning slowly, Holloway saw a glimpse of pink fabric behind a large oak tree. The girl was hiding, watching him warily from her makeshift shelter. Holloway's heart ached at the fear he saw in her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged on the damp forest floor. He wanted to appear as non-threatening as possible. "There you are," he said softly, offering a gentle smile. "That was quite a run, huh? You're pretty fast." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't run either. Holloway took that as a good sign. "I bet you're wondering why I followed you," he continued, keeping his voice low and soothing. "The truth is, I'm worried about you. It's not safe for a young girl to be out here alone, especially in this weather." He paused, watching her carefully. She was still clutching those yellow shoes to her chest, her knuckles white with the effort. "You know, I had a little girl once," Holloway said, his voice catching slightly on the words. "Her name was Emma. She loved to run too, always keeping me on my toes." Something flickered in the girl's eyes at the mention of Emma. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a shared experience. "I bet those shoes are pretty special to you, huh?" Holloway nodded towards the yellow heels. "They look like they might have belonged to someone important." The girl's grip on the shoes tightened, but she didn't run. Instead, she seemed to be listening intently, her eyes never leaving Holloway's face. Encouraged, Holloway pressed on. "I understand if you're scared. The world can be a pretty frightening place sometimes, but you don't have to face it alone. There are people who want to help you, to keep you safe. I want to be one of those people if you'll let me." He held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace. "What do you say we get out of this wet forest and find somewhere warm and dry? I promise, no one's going to make you do anything you don't want to do. We can take things one step at a time." For a long moment the forest was silent. Holloway held his breath, hoping against hope that he'd gotten through to her. Then, slowly, cautiously, the girl emerged from behind the tree. Her dress was torn and muddy, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear and focused as she looked at Holloway. "That's it," he said softly, not daring to move. "You're doing great. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's lips moved, and for the first time Holloway heard her voice. It was barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet of the forest it rang out clear as a bell. "Layla," she said. "My name is Layla." Holloway felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "It's nice to meet you, Layla," he said, his voice warm with genuine emotion. "Thank you for trusting me. Now, what do you say we head back to my car? I've got a nice warm blanket there, and we can figure out what to do next. Together." Layla hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. As Holloway slowly got to his feet, she took a tentative step towards him. It was at that moment that Holloway's radio crackled to life, startling them both. "Dispatch to Officer Holloway, what's your location? Do you need backup?" Layla flinched at the sudden noise, her eyes widening in fear. But before she could bolt again, Holloway held up a reassuring hand. "It's okay," he said quickly. "It's just my radio. I need to let them know I'm all right. Is that okay with you?" After a moment's hesitation, Layla nodded. Holloway smiled at her, then spoke into his radio. "Holloway here. Situation under control. No backup needed. I'm escorting a young girl back to the station. We'll need a social worker on standby." "Copy that," came the response. "We'll have someone waiting." As Holloway lowered his radio, he saw Layla watching him intently. "Ready to go?" he asked gently. In response, Layla took another step towards him, then another, and another. As they made their way slowly back through the forest, Holloway kept a careful eye on Layla. She walked beside him, close enough that he could reach out and touch her if needed, but still maintaining a cautious distance. The yellow shoes remained clutched tightly to her chest, a silent reminder of whatever story had brought her to this point. "You're doing great, Layla," Holloway said softly as they navigated around a fallen tree. "We're almost back to the street. My car's not far from there." Layla nodded, her eyes darting around nervously as if expecting danger to leap out from behind every tree. Holloway's heart ached at the sight. No child should have to live with that kind of fear. As they emerged from the forest, the soft glow of streetlights greeted them. Layla squinted against the sudden brightness, instinctively moving closer to Holloway. "There we go," Holloway said, gesturing towards his patrol car parked a short distance away. "Let's get you warmed up, okay?" They approached the car slowly, Holloway keenly aware of how intimidating a police vehicle might seem to a frightened child. But Layla surprised him, walking right up to the passenger side door without hesitation. Holloway opened the door for her, then reached into the back seat to grab a thick, warm blanket. "Here you go," he said, draping it gently over Layla's shoulders. "That should help with the chill." As Layla settled into the passenger seat, Holloway crouched down beside her, keeping the door open to avoid making her feel trapped. "Layla," he said gently, "I know you've been through a lot today, but I want you to know that you're safe now. I'm going to take you to the police station where we can get you some food and dry clothes. Is that okay with you?" Layla nodded, her hands still clutching the yellow shoes beneath the blanket. "Good," Holloway smiled. "Now, I know you might not want to talk about it right now, but if there's anyone you want me to call, your parents maybe, or—" He trailed off as Layla's eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembling. Hey, it's okay," Holloway said quickly, mentally kicking himself for bringing up parents again. "We don't have to talk about that now. Let's just focus on getting you warm and dry, all right?" Layla nodded again, wiping her eyes with the corner of the blanket. Holloway stood up, closing the passenger door gently before making his way to the driver's side. As he slid into his seat, he couldn't help but marvel at the turn this day had taken. What had started as a routine patrol had somehow led to this moment, with a frightened, mysterious girl sitting beside him, clutching a pair of yellow shoes like a lifeline. With a deep breath, Officer Mark Holloway put the car in drive and headed towards the station, keenly aware that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The soft hum of the police station's fluorescent lights filled the air as Officer Holloway guided Layla through the bustling corridors. He'd chosen a quieter, less traveled route to a small room often used for interviewing children or victims of sensitive crimes. It was designed to be comforting, painted in warm colors, furnished with comfortable chairs and a small couch, and stocked with books and toys. "Here we are," Holloway said softly, ushering Layla into the room. "Why don't you have a seat wherever you'd like?" Layla hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Then, slowly, she made her way to a plush armchair in the corner, curling up in it with her feet tucked underneath her. The yellow shoes remained firmly in her grasp. Holloway grabbed another blanket from a nearby shelf and gently draped it over her. "There you go," he said with a warm smile. "That should help you warm up. Now how about some hot chocolate? I make a mean cup if I do say so myself." For the first time since they'd met, a ghost of a smile flickered across Layla's face. She nodded, her grip on the shoes loosening ever so slightly. "Great," Holloway grinned. "I'll be right back. You just sit tight, okay?" As he turned to leave, a soft voice stopped him. "Thank you," Layla whispered, her words barely audible. Holloway felt his heart swell. "You're welcome, Layla," he replied gently. "I'm glad I can help." He stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar so Layla wouldn't feel trapped. As he made his way to the break room to prepare the hot chocolate, he spotted his colleague, Officer Maria Rodriguez, heading his way. "Mark," she called out, her brow furrowed with concern. "I heard you brought in a child. What's going on?" Holloway quickly filled her in on the situation, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard. "I was hoping you might be able to sit with her while I make some calls," he finished. "She seems pretty shaken up, and I think having a woman around might make her feel more comfortable." Maria nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll grab some snacks from the vending machine too. Poor thing's probably hungry." "Thanks, Maria," Holloway said gratefully. "I owe you one." As Maria headed off to gather supplies, Holloway quickly prepared 2 cups of hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows to Layla's. He then made his way back to the interview room, knocking gently before entering. Layla was exactly where he'd left her, her eyes fixed on the yellow shoes in her lap. She looked up as Holloway entered, her gaze immediately landing on the steaming mug in his hand. "Here you go," he said, setting the hot chocolate on a small table next to her chair. "Careful, it's hot, and I hope you like marshmallows. I may have gone a bit overboard." Layla reached out tentatively, wrapping her small hands around the warm mug. "Thank you," she murmured again, inhaling the sweet aroma. "You're very welcome," Holloway replied, taking a seat across from her. "Listen, Layla, I have a friend who's going to come sit with you for a little while. Her name is Officer Maria, and she's really nice. Is that okay with you?" Layla's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "Hey, it's all right," Holloway reassured her quickly. "I'm not going far, I promise. I just need to make a few phone calls to try and figure out how to help you. Maria will stay with you, and I'll be back before you know it, okay?" After a moment's hesitation, Layla nodded. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Maria entered, her arms full of snacks and a change of clothes. "Hi there," she said warmly, smiling at Layla. "I'm Maria. I brought some goodies and some dry clothes if you'd like to change." Layla eyed the newcomer warily but didn't shy away. Holloway took that as a good sign. As he left the room, Holloway could hear Maria's gentle voice asking Layla if she'd like a sandwich. He smiled to himself, grateful for his colleague's kindness. Making his way to his desk, Holloway's mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? Where had she come from? And what was the story behind those yellow shoes she guarded so fiercely? He had a feeling the answers wouldn't be easy to find, but he was determined to try. For Layla's sake, he had to. With a deep breath, Officer Holloway picked up his phone and began to dial. The real work was just beginning. Officer Mark Holloway sat at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear as he listened to the voice on the other end. His free hand absently tapped a pen against the stack of paperwork in front of him, his mind racing as he processed the information he was receiving. "Yes, I understand," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Thank you for the information. We'll proceed accordingly." As he hung up the phone, Holloway leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The call had confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Layla was a runaway from the Everbright orphanage, just a few miles outside of town. They'd reported her missing earlier that day, worried sick about her safety. On the surface, it seemed simple. He should call the orphanage, let them know Layla had been found safe, and arrange for her return. It was protocol, the proper procedure. But something held him back, a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that told him there was more to this story. He thought about Layla, curled up in that interview room, clutching those yellow shoes like they were her only lifeline in a stormy sea. The fear in her eyes, the reluctance to speak about her past, it all pointed to a deeper trauma, one that returning her to the orphanage might not address. Holloway's mind drifted to his own loss, the ache in his heart that had never truly healed since the night he lost his wife and daughter. He remembered the helplessness, the overwhelming grief, the feeling that the world had suddenly become a colder, darker place. Was that what Layla was feeling? Had she run away seeking something the orphanage couldn't provide, a sense of belonging, of family, of home? With a heavy sigh, Holloway stood up and made his way back to the interview room. He paused outside the door, listening to the soft murmur of voices within. Maria's gentle tones mixed with Layla's quieter responses, punctuated by occasional moments of silence. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly before entering. The scene that greeted him warmed his heart despite the turmoil in his mind. Layla, now dressed in dry clothes, sat cross-legged on the couch, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand. Maria sat beside her, apparently in the middle of telling a story that had captured Layla's attention. Both looked up as Holloway entered. "Hey there," he said, offering a warm smile. "How are we doing in here?" "Much better," Maria replied, returning his smile. "Our friend here was just telling me about her favorite book. Turns out we're both fans of Charlotte's Web." Layla nodded shyly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's great," Holloway said, his voice gentle. "Layla, would it be okay if I talked to you for a bit? Maria can stay if you'd like." Layla's smile faded, replaced by a look of apprehension. She glanced at Maria, then back at Holloway, before giving a small nod. "I'll stay," Maria said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Layla's shoulder. Holloway pulled up a chair sitting across from them. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Layla," he began, his voice gentle but serious, "I need to ask you something important. Can you tell me why you ran away from the orphanage?" Layla's eyes widened, her body tensing visibly. Her gaze dropped to the yellow shoes which sat on the couch beside her. "It's okay," Holloway reassured her. "You're not in trouble. I just want to understand so I can help you." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Layla spoke. "They don't understand," she said, her words heavy with emotion. "They want me to forget, but I can't, I won't." Holloway felt a lump form in his throat. "Forget what, Layla?" Tears welled up in Layla's eyes as she picked up the yellow shoes. "My mum," she said, her voice cracking. "These were hers, they're all I have left, but they wanted me to give them up. Said I needed to move on, to let go." She hugged the shoes to her chest, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "But I can't, I miss her so much." The room fell silent save for Layla's quiet sobs. Maria wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort. Holloway felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The pain in Layla's voice, the desperation in her eyes. It was all too familiar. He saw himself in her, recognized the raw grief that time had yet to heal. In that moment, Holloway knew he couldn't simply send her back. Protocol or not, he couldn't return this broken, grieving child to a place that didn't understand her pain, that wanted her to forget instead of helping her heal. But what could he do? The system had rules, procedures that couldn't simply be ignored. And yet, looking at Layla, Holloway knew he had to try. Somehow he had to find a way to help her, to give her the understanding and support she so desperately needed. As Layla's sobs quieted, Holloway made a decision. It wouldn't be easy, and he had no idea where it might lead, but he knew it was the right thing to do. "Layla," he said softly, waiting until she looked up at him, "I want you to know something. I understand how you feel. I lost someone too, my wife and daughter, and I know how much it hurts, how sometimes it feels like you can't breathe because you miss them so much." Layla's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. "I promise you," Holloway continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm going to do everything I can to help you. We'll figure this out together, okay? You don't have to face this alone anymore." For the first time since he'd found her at that bus stop, Holloway saw a glimmer of hope in Layla's eyes. She nodded, clutching the yellow shoes a little less tightly. As Maria continued to comfort Layla, Holloway stood up, his mind already racing with possibilities. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this child down. Whatever it took, he would find a way to give Layla the support and understanding she needed to heal. With renewed determination, Officer Mark Holloway left the room, ready to challenge the system if necessary to do what was right for Layla. The journey ahead would be difficult, but looking back at the little girl with the yellow shoes, he knew it would be worth it. The police station hummed with its usual activity as Officer Holloway paced the corridor outside the interview room. His mind raced with possibilities, each scenario presenting its own set of challenges and potential consequences. He knew that what he was considering, finding a way to keep Layla out of the orphanage system, was unorthodox at best and potentially career-ending at worst. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Jensen, the social worker assigned to Layla's case. Her brisk walk and furrowed brow spoke volumes about the urgency of the situation. "Officer Holloway," she greeted him, her voice clipped and professional. "I understand you're the one who found Layla Thompson. I need to speak with her immediately and arrange for her return to Everbright Orphanage." Holloway felt his heart sink. This was the moment of truth, the point where his duty as an officer clashed head-on with what he believed was right for Layla. "Ms. Jensen," he began, choosing his words carefully, "before you speak with Layla, there's something you need to know. The situation is complicated." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Complicated how, officer?" Holloway took a deep breath, then launched into an explanation of everything that had transpired since he found Layla at the bus stop. He told Sarah about the yellow shoes, about Layla's fear and grief, and about the orphanage's apparent lack of understanding when it came to helping her process her loss. As he spoke, he could see Sarah's expression softening, her professional detachment giving way to genuine concern. "I understand that protocol dictates she should return to Everbright immediately," Holloway concluded, his voice low and earnest. "But I'm asking you to consider an alternative. This girl needs more than just a roof over her head. She needs understanding, patience, and support to deal with her grief." Sarah Jensen was silent for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful as she processed Holloway's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "Officer Holloway, I appreciate your concern for Layla, but you must understand there are procedures in place for a reason. We can't simply ignore them because we feel emotionally invested in a case." Holloway felt his heart sink, but he wasn't ready to give up. "I know that, Ms. Jensen, but surely there's some flexibility in the system, some way we can ensure Layla gets the specific care she needs?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple. Everbright is her legal guardian. They've reported her missing, and they're expecting her return. We can't just—" She was interrupted by the sound of the interview room door opening. Maria stepped out, her expression concerned. "Mark," she said quietly, "Layla's asking for you. She seems pretty upset." Holloway glanced at Sarah, who nodded her assent. Together they entered the room where they found Layla curled up in the armchair, her eyes red-rimmed and fearful. "Hey there, Layla," Holloway said gently, crouching down beside her. "What's wrong?" Layla's eyes darted between Holloway and Sarah, her grip tightening on the yellow shoes in her lap. Are you sending me back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The pain in her voice was like a physical blow to Holloway. He looked up at Sarah, silently pleading for her understanding. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor softening as she addressed Layla. "Hello, Layla. My name is Sarah. I'm here to help make sure you're safe and taken care of. Can you tell me why you don't want to go back to Everbright?" Layla's lower lip trembled, but she spoke, her words coming out in a rush. "They don't understand. They want me to forget Mom, to give away her things, but I can't. These shoes, they're all I have left. And the other kids, they make fun of me for being sad all the time. I don't belong there." Sarah listened intently, her expression softening with each word. When Layla finished speaking, Sarah knelt down beside Holloway, bringing herself to eye level with the girl. "Layla," she said gently, "I'm so sorry you've been feeling this way. Losing a parent is incredibly hard, and it's okay to be sad. It's okay to want to hold on to memories of your mum." Layla looked up, surprise and hope mingling in her eyes. Sarah continued, her voice warm and reassuring. "I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to help you, but for now, we need to make sure you're somewhere safe. Do you think you could be brave and go back to Everbright for a little while, just until we figure out the best way to help you?" Layla's face fell, fear creeping back into her expression. "But what if they try to take Mom's shoes again? What if—" "They won't," Holloway interjected firmly. He looked at Sarah, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small nod and he continued, "I promise you, Layla, no one is going to take those shoes from you, and I'll make sure the people at Everbright understand how important they are, okay?" Layla studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Sarah stood up, her decision made. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Officer Holloway will drive you back to Everbright. I'm going to call ahead and explain the situation to them. And in the meantime, I'll start looking into other options for your care. Options that might be better suited to help you deal with your loss. How does that sound?" Layla nodded again, a flicker of relief passing across her face. Holloway felt a wave of gratitude towards Sarah. She had found a middle ground, a way to follow protocol while still addressing Layla's unique needs. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. "Thank you," he said quietly to Sarah as they prepared to leave. She gave him a small smile. "Don't thank me yet, officer. We've still got a long road ahead, but I think you're right. This girl needs more than just standard care. I'll do what I can to help." As they left the interview room, Layla walking between them with her yellow shoes clutched tightly to her chest, Holloway felt a mix of emotions. Relief that Layla wouldn't be simply thrust back into a situation that was causing her pain. Hope that they might be able to find a better solution for her, and a growing sense of determination. He knew this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. But looking down at Layla, seeing the trust in her eyes as she walked beside him, Holloway knew he would do whatever it took to help this child find her way through her grief and towards a brighter future. As they stepped out into the evening air, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky, Officer Mark Holloway made a silent promise. To Layla, to himself, and to the memory of his own lost family. He would see this through no matter what it took. The patrol car moved slowly through the quiet streets of Westford, its headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. Inside, Officer Holloway kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, his eyes drawn to the small figure huddled in the back seat. Layla sat silently, her gaze fixed on the yellow shoes in her lap, her expression a mixture of resignation and fear. Holloway's colleague, Officer Johnson, sat in the passenger seat, having volunteered to accompany them on the drive back to Everbright Orphanage. The car was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. As they turned onto the long tree-lined driveway leading to Everbright, Holloway felt a knot forming in his stomach. He could see Layla's reflection in the mirror, watched as her body tensed with each passing second. "We're almost there, Layla," he said gently, trying to keep his voice steady and reassuring. "Remember what we talked about. No one's going to take your mum's shoes away, I promise." Layla nodded slightly, but her grip on the shoes tightened visibly. The orphanage came into view, a large, somewhat austere building that looked more institutional than homely. Lights blazed from several windows, and as they pulled up to the entrance, Holloway could see figures moving inside. He parked the car and turned to face Layla. "Ready?" he asked softly. Layla looked up at him, her eyes wide with apprehension. She shook her head slightly. "I know it's scary," Holloway said, his heart aching for the frightened child. "But remember, this is just temporary. Ms. Jensen is working on finding a better situation for you, and I'll be checking in, making sure you're okay. You're not alone in this, Layla." After a moment, Layla gave a small nod. Holloway stepped out of the car and opened the back door for her. As she climbed out, clutching the yellow shoes to her chest, the front door of the orphanage opened. A middle-aged woman with a stern face stepped out, followed by a younger man. "Layla Thompson," the woman said, her voice a mix of relief and exasperation. "Thank goodness you're safe. Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" Layla shrank back slightly, moving closer to Holloway. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. "Mrs. Blackwood," Holloway greeted the woman, recognizing her as the orphanage director from his earlier phone conversation with Sarah Jensen. I'm Officer Holloway. I believe Ms. Jensen from Social Services called ahead about Layla's situation. Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Yes, she did. Though I must say, I don't quite understand all this fuss. Layla, come along now. It's past dinner time and you must be hungry. As Mrs. Blackwood reached out to take Layla's arm, the girl flinched away, a small whimper escaping her lips. Mrs. Blackwood, Holloway interjected, his voice firm but polite. If I could have a word with you in private, there are some things we need to discuss regarding Layla's care. The director looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Mr. Carter, she addressed the younger man. Please take Layla inside and get her something to eat. Actually, Holloway said quickly, I was hoping Officer Johnson could stay with Layla while we talk, just to help her feel more comfortable with the transition. Mrs. Blackwood frowned but agreed. As they walked towards the building, Holloway glanced back to see Johnson crouching down to speak softly to Layla, who seemed to relax slightly in the officer's presence. Inside Mrs. Blackwood's office, Holloway wasted no time in addressing the issue at hand. He explained in detail about Layla's emotional state, her attachment to her mother's shoes, and the importance of allowing her to grieve at her own pace. Officer Holloway, Mrs. Blackwood said when he finished, her tone measured, I understand your concern, but you must realize we have protocols in place for a reason. Layla needs to learn to move on, to integrate with the other children. Clinging to the past won't help her do that. Holloway felt a surge of frustration but kept his voice calm. With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwood, grief isn't something you can just switch off. Layla needs support and understanding, not pressure to move on. Those shoes are her connection to her mother. Taking them away or making her feel ashamed for holding on to them could do serious emotional damage. The director was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. Very well, officer. We'll allow Layla to keep the shoes for now, but I hope you understand we can't give her special treatment indefinitely. It's not fair to the other children. Holloway nodded, feeling a small sense of victory. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. That's all I'm asking for now. Give her time, be patient with her, and please, if there are any issues, don't hesitate to contact me or Ms. Jensen. As they walked back to the entrance, Holloway saw Layla sitting with Officer Johnson in the common room. She looked up as they approached, fear flickering across her face. Holloway knelt down beside her. Hey, Layla, everything's going to be okay. Mrs. Blackwood understands about the shoes now. You can keep them with you, all right? Layla nodded, relief evident in her eyes. You'll come back, she whispered. Of course, Holloway promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll check in on you soon, and remember, Ms. Jensen is working on finding a better place for you. This is just temporary. As he stood to leave, Layla suddenly threw her arms around him in a tight hug. Holloway hugged her back, feeling a lump form in his throat. Be brave, Layla, he murmured. You're stronger than you know. Walking back to the patrol car, Holloway felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Relief that he'd managed to secure some concessions for Layla, but also a deep sadness at leaving her in a place where she felt so alone and misunderstood. As he drove away from Everbright, the image of Layla's sad, frightened face stayed with him. He knew this wasn't over. Somehow, some way, he had to find a better solution for her. The road ahead would be challenging, but looking at the orphanage receding in his rearview mirror, Officer Mark Holloway made a silent vow. He would not let Layla down. Whatever it took, he would find a way to give her the home and understanding she so desperately needed. Holloway spent the next few hours at the station, mechanically going through his paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to Layla. As the evening wore on, his unease grew. By the time his shift ended, he knew he couldn't just go home and leave things as they were. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he found himself in his car, driving back through the quiet streets towards Everbright Orphanage. The night was still and dark as Officer Mark Holloway's patrol car crept along the tree-lined driveway leading to Everbright Orphanage. The dashboard clock glowed 11:30 p.m., its red digits a stark contrast to the blackness outside. As the imposing silhouette of the orphanage loomed into view, Holloway felt a mix of determination and apprehension settle in his stomach. He pulled into the parking lot and switched off the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. Holloway stepped out of the car, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the warmth of the vehicle. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. Then, with determined steps, he approached the front door and rang the bell. Several long moments passed before a light flickered on inside. The door opened to reveal a sleepy-looking night attendant, confusion etched on his face. "Officer, is everything all right?" Holloway nodded, trying to project an air of calm authority. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm here about Layla Thompson, the girl we brought in earlier. There's been a development in her case, and I need to speak with her immediately." The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure about the unusual request. "Sir, it's very late. The children are all asleep." "I understand," Holloway said, his voice firm but kind. "But this is a sensitive matter that can't wait until morning. I've already cleared it with Mrs. Blackwood." It was a lie, but a necessary one, he told himself. After another moment's hesitation, the attendant nodded and stepped aside. "All right, officer. I'll take you to her room." As they walked through the quiet hallways, Holloway's mind raced. He was operating on pure instinct now, driven by a need to protect this child that he couldn't fully explain even to himself. They stopped outside a door near the end of a long corridor. The attendant knocked softly, then opened the door. "Layla," he called quietly, "there's someone here to see you." Holloway stepped into the small, sparsely furnished room. In the dim light from the hallway, he could make out Layla's small form huddled under the covers of a narrow bed. As she sat up, rubbing her eyes, Holloway's heart clenched at the fear that immediately flooded her face. "It's okay, Layla," he said softly, moving closer to the bed. "It's just me, Officer Holloway, remember?" Recognition dawned in her eyes, quickly followed by confusion. "Officer Holloway," she whispered. "What's wrong? Did I do something bad?" No, Holloway reassured her quickly. He turned to the attendant hovering in the doorway. "Could you give us a moment, please? Official police business." Once they were alone, Holloway sat on the edge of Layla's bed. In the faint moonlight streaming through the window, he could see the yellow shoes placed carefully on the nightstand beside her. "Layla," he began, his voice gentle, "I know it's late and I'm sorry for waking you, but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about how scared and alone you must be feeling right now." Layla's lower lip trembled, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't want to be here," she whispered. "I want to go home, but home is gone." Holloway felt his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. Without thinking, he reached out and took Layla's small hand in his. "I know, sweetheart, and I'm so sorry you're going through this, but I want you to know that you're not alone, not anymore." He took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. "Layla, how would you feel if I stayed here tonight? Not in your room, of course, but just in the building. So you'd know that someone who understands, someone who cares about you, is nearby if you need them." Layla's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and hope flickering across her face. You'd do that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Holloway nodded, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I would. I know it's not much and it doesn't solve everything, but I want you to feel safe, Layla. I want you to know that someone's looking out for you." For a moment, Layla was silent, her gaze shifting between Holloway and the yellow shoes on her nightstand. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'd like that." Relief washed over Holloway. He smiled warmly at Layla. "All right, then. I'll go talk to the night attendant and arrange everything. You try to get some sleep, okay? I'll be nearby if you need anything." As he stood to leave, Layla's hand tightened on his. "Officer Holloway?" she said, her voice small but steady. "Thank you." Holloway felt a lump form in his throat. "You're welcome, Layla," he replied softly. "Now get some rest. I'll see you in the morning." Stepping out of the room, Holloway found the night attendant waiting in the hallway, a mixture of curiosity and concern on his face. "Is everything all right, officer?" he asked. Holloway nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Yes, but I'm going to need to stay here tonight. It's a sensitive situation. Is there somewhere I could sleep? A couch in the office, maybe?" The attendant's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Stay the night? I'm not sure that's allowed, Mrs. Blackwood." "I understand your concern," Holloway interrupted gently but firmly. "But this is a matter of child protection. I've been authorized to take whatever steps necessary to ensure Layla's safety and well-being." Another white lie, but one he felt was justified under the circumstances. After a moment's hesitation, the attendant nodded. "Well, I suppose there's a small break room with a couch. It's not very comfortable, but—" "It'll be perfect," Holloway assured him. "Thank you for your cooperation." The break room was indeed small, with a worn couch that had seen better days, a rickety table, and a small kitchenette. But to Holloway, it was perfect. He thanked the attendant again and settled in for the night, his mind racing with thoughts of what the morning might bring. As he lay on the couch staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, Holloway knew he was crossing a line. This wasn't procedure, wasn't protocol. He was letting his emotions guide his actions, something he'd always cautioned against in his years on the force. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Layla's face. He remembered the feel of her tiny hand in his, the trust in her eyes when he promised to stay. And he knew deep in his heart that he was doing the right thing. Sleep came fitfully that night. Holloway dozed on and off, always alert for any sound that might indicate Layla needed him. But the orphanage remained quiet, the only noises the occasional creak of the old building settling. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window, Holloway sat up, rubbing his tired eyes. He knew the day ahead would be challenging. There would be questions to answer, explanations to give. Mrs. Blackwood would likely be furious, and he might even face disciplinary action at work. But as he stood, stretching his stiff muscles, Holloway felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever consequences he might face, he knew he'd made the right choice. For the first time since losing his own family, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find the night attendant, looking both relieved and anxious. "Officer Holloway," he said, "Layla's awake. She's asking for you." Holloway nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you. I'll go see her now." As he made his way back to Layla's room, Holloway's mind was already working on the next steps. He knew this unconventional night's stay was just the beginning. Somehow he had to find a way to give Layla the stability and care she so desperately needed. He knocked gently on Layla's door before entering. She was sitting up in bed, the yellow shoes clutched to her chest, her eyes bright and alert despite the early hour. "Good morning, Layla," Holloway said softly. "How did you sleep?" Layla's face broke into a small but genuine smile. "Better," she said simply. "You stayed." Holloway felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "Of course I did. I promised, didn't I?" As he sat down on the edge of her bed, Holloway knew that this moment marked a turning point, for both of them. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and uncertainties, but looking at Layla's trusting face, he felt ready to face whatever came their way. The soft golden light of early morning filtered through the thin curtains of Layla's room at Everbright Orphanage. Officer Mark Holloway sat in a chair by the window, watching as Layla finished her breakfast, brought in by a slightly bewildered staff member. The yellow shoes sat on the nightstand, a silent reminder of the journey that had brought them to this moment. As Layla set aside her empty tray, Holloway leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "So, Layla," he began gently, "how are you feeling this morning?" Layla looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. "Good," she said softly. I didn't have any bad dreams last night." Holloway felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's good to hear," he said with a warm smile. "I'm glad I could help, even just a little bit." A moment of comfortable silence passed between them. Before Holloway spoke again, his voice careful and measured. "Layla, I've been thinking a lot about your situation, about how we can make things better for you." Layla's eyes widened slightly, a mix of hope and apprehension flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Holloway took a deep breath. What he was about to propose was huge, life-changing for both of them, but in his heart he knew it was right. "Well," he began, "I was wondering how you'd feel about coming to live with me. Not right away, of course. There's a lot that would need to be done first, but maybe as a foster child to start with." The words hung in the air between them. Layla stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You want me to live with you?" she whispered. Holloway nodded, his heart racing. "I do. I know it's a big change, and it might be scary. But I want to give you a home, Layla. A place where you can feel safe, where you can grieve for your mum without feeling rushed or judged, where you can just be yourself." Tears welled up in Layla's eyes. For a moment, Holloway feared he'd overwhelmed her, moved too fast. But then she launched herself off the bed and into his arms, hugging him tightly. "Yes," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Yes, please." Holloway hugged her back, feeling his own eyes grow damp. "Okay," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, we'll make this happen, Layla, I promise." As Layla's sobs subsided into quiet sniffles, Holloway gently pulled back, looking into her tear-stained face. "Now, it's not going to be easy," he explained. "There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of checks and balances to go through. It might take some time, but I'm going to do everything I can to make this work, okay?" Layla nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Okay," she echoed. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their moment. Mrs. Blackwood entered, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Officer Holloway," she said, her voice clipped. "A word, please. In my office, now." Holloway stood, giving Layla's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be right back," he promised. "Why don't you get dressed while I'm gone?" As he followed Mrs. Blackwood to her office, Holloway steeled himself for the confrontation to come. He knew his actions last night were unorthodox, to say the least, but he was prepared to fight for what he believed was right. In the office, Mrs. Blackwood rounded on him the moment the door closed. "Officer Holloway, what on earth do you think you're doing? Staying the night without authorization? Interfering with our procedures? This is completely unacceptable." Holloway held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand your concerns, but Layla's case is unique. She needs specialized care and attention that, with all due respect, Everbright isn't equipped to provide." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "And I suppose you think you're equipped to provide it?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "As a matter of fact, yes," Holloway replied steadily. "I've decided to apply to become Layla's foster parent." The declaration hung in the air between them. Mrs. Blackwood stared at him, momentarily speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was laced with disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're a police officer, not a childcare professional. You have no experience." "I was a father," Holloway interrupted, his voice soft but intense. "I know what it's like to love a child, to want to protect them from the world's cruelties, and I know what it's like to lose everything, just like Layla does." Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly, a flicker of understanding passing across her face. "Officer Holloway," she said, her tone gentler now, "I can see you care for the girl, but fostering a child, especially one with Layla's emotional needs, is a huge responsibility. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Holloway nodded, his resolve firm. "I am. I know it won't be easy, but I'm committed to giving Layla the home and support she needs." Mrs. Blackwood sighed, sinking into her chair. "Well, I can't stop you from applying, but you should know the process is lengthy and rigorous. There's no guarantee you'll be approved." "I understand," Holloway said, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." As he left Mrs. Blackwood's office, Holloway felt a mix of emotions swirling within him. Anxiety about the challenges ahead, fear of the unknown, but also an overwhelming sense of hope and purpose. He made his way back to Layla's room, finding her dressed and sitting on the bed, the yellow shoes cradled in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. Holloway smiled, sitting down beside her. "Everything's going to be okay," he assured her. "It might take some time, but we're going to make this work. Together." Layla nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Together," she echoed softly. As they sat there, the morning sun streaming through the window, Holloway felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years he felt truly alive. He had found a new purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Officer Mark, Holloway and Layla. The process of becoming a foster parent was indeed rigorous, involving mountains of paperwork, background checks, home inspections and interviews. But Holloway threw himself into it with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Every spare moment was dedicated to preparing for Layla's arrival. He cleaned out the spare room in his modest home, painting the walls a soft yellow at Layla's shy request. He bought a new bed, a small desk and a bookshelf. Filling it with books he remembered his own daughter loving at Layla's age. Throughout it all, he made sure to visit Layla at Everbright as often as possible. Each visit brought a brighter smile to her face, a growing spark of hope in her eyes. They would talk for hours, Holloway sharing stories of his own childhood and listening intently as Layla slowly opened up about her mother and her life before the orphanage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, the day arrived. Holloway stood in the lobby of Everbright, his heart racing as he waited for Layla to come down. When she appeared at the top of the stairs, a small suitcase in one hand and her mother's yellow shoes in the other, Holloway felt a lump form in his throat. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly as she reached him. Layla nodded, a mix of excitement and nervousness on her face. "Home," she repeated, as if testing out the word. The drive to Holloway's house was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the changes ahead. As they pulled into the driveway, Holloway turned to Layla. "Welcome home, kiddo," he said with a warm smile. Inside, Holloway showed Layla to her new room. He watched as she took it all in, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is all for me?" she asked in disbelief. Holloway nodded. "All for you. I hope you like it." Layla walked slowly around the room, running her hand over the new bedspread, the smooth surface of the desk. Finally, she turned to Holloway, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Holloway replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Now, why don't you start unpacking while I get dinner started?" As the days turned into weeks, Holloway and Layla began to settle into a routine. There were challenges, of course. Nightmares that had Layla waking up screaming for her mother. Days when grief overwhelmed her, leaving her quiet and withdrawn. Moments of frustration as they both adjusted to their new roles. But there were also moments of joy and connection that made it all worthwhile. The first time Layla laughed at one of Holloway's terrible dad jokes, the evening they spent building a blanket fort in the living room and reading stories by flashlight. The Saturday morning, Layla tentatively asked if she could help Holloway make pancakes, standing on a stool beside him at the stove. One evening, as they were settling into their new routine, Holloway was helping her unpack the last of her things from Everbright. As they worked, Layla suddenly paused, holding her mother's yellow shoes in her hands. "Officer Holloway?" she said quietly. "Yes, Layla," he replied, noting the serious look on her face. I don't know where to put these," she said, gesturing to the shoes. "They don't really fit anywhere." Holloway understood the deeper meaning behind her words. These shoes, this tangible connection to her mother, didn't seem to fit in her new life. But he also knew how important they were to her. Kneeling down beside her, Holloway gently took the shoes and placed them on the floor beside her bed. "How about here?" he suggested. "They'll be close by, but not in the way." Layla looked at the shoes, then back at Holloway, uncertainty in her eyes. "But won't they get in the way?" she asked softly. Holloway shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. Not at all. They're part of you, Layla, part of your story. They don't have to be hidden away. He reached out and took Layla's small hand in his. You know, your mom will always be with you, no matter where those shoes are. She's in your memories, in your heart. These shoes are just a reminder of her love for you. Layla's eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of understanding in them too. Really, she whispered. Really, Holloway affirmed. And you know what? It's okay to keep them close. It's okay to miss her and to want to remember her. We can make space for those memories here, in your new home. A small smile tugged at the corners of Layla's mouth. I'd like that, she said softly. Holloway gave her hand a gentle squeeze. How about we put them under the bed? That way they're safe and close, but not in the way. And any time you want to look at them or hold them, they'll be right there. Layla nodded, wiping away a tear with her free hand. Together they gently slid the yellow shoes under the bed, positioning them so that just the toes peeked out. As they stood up, Layla suddenly threw her arms around Holloway's waist, hugging him tightly. Thank you, she murmured into his shirt. Holloway hugged her back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. You're welcome, sweetheart, he said softly. Remember, we're in this together. That night, as Holloway tucked Layla into bed, he noticed a new sense of peace in her eyes. The yellow shoes under the bed seemed to have found their place, just as Layla was finding hers in this new chapter of her life. As the weeks turned into months, Holloway and Layla's bond grew stronger. They developed their own little rituals and inside jokes. Holloway learned to braid Layla's hair. Layla discovered a love for Holloway's terrible puns, giggling even as she rolled her eyes at them. There were still difficult days, of course, days when the loss of her mother hit Layla hard, leaving her quiet and withdrawn. But now, instead of facing those moments alone, she had Holloway to lean on. He would sit with her, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of his own losses, helping her understand that grief was a journey they could navigate together. Holloway, too, found healing in their growing relationship. The hole left by the loss of his wife and daughter would never fully close, but Layla's presence brought a new light into his life. Her laughter filled the once quiet house, her drawings adorned the refrigerator, and her growing confidence gave him a sense of purpose he'd thought he'd lost forever. One Saturday morning, as they sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast, Layla looked up from her cereal with a thoughtful expression. "Officer Holloway?" she asked. "Yes, Layla," he replied, lowering his coffee mug. Do you think it would be okay if I called you Dad?" Her voice was hesitant, almost afraid. Holloway felt his heart skip a beat. He set down his mug, taking a moment to compose himself before answering. "Layla," he said gently, "I would be honored if you called me Dad, but only if you're comfortable with it. There's no rush, and if you're not ready, that's okay too." Layla nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I think I'd like to," she said softly. "Is that okay?" Holloway felt tears prick at his eyes. "It's more than okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's wonderful." From that day forward, their relationship shifted subtly but profoundly. The word Dad started to slip into Layla's vocabulary more frequently, each utterance a balm to Holloway's long, grieving heart. And for Layla, it seemed to bring a new sense of belonging, of having found her place in the world once again. As spring turned to summer, Holloway and Layla settled into their new life together. The yellow shoes remained under Layla's bed, a cherished reminder of the mother she'd lost. But now they were joined by new mementos: a seashell from their first trip to the beach, a ribbon from Layla's first dance recital, a Father's Day card carefully crafted with glitter and love. The day of the adoption hearing dawned bright and clear, a perfect late summer morning. Officer Mark Holloway stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with slightly shaking hands. The past year had been a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and incredible joys, and now, finally, they had reached this momentous day. "Dad," Layla's voice called from down the hall, "are you ready?" Holloway smiled at the word that still sent a warm feeling through his chest every time he heard it. "Almost, sweetheart," he called back. "Just finishing up." He took a deep breath, looking at his reflection. The man staring back at him was different from the one who had found a frightened little girl at a bus stop over a year ago. There was life in his eyes now, purpose in his stance. Layla had brought color back into his world, healing parts of him he'd thought were broken beyond repair. Stepping out into the hallway, Holloway's breath caught in his throat. Layla stood there in a pretty yellow dress, her hair neatly braided, a skill Holloway had finally mastered after months of practice. In her hands she held a shoebox. "You look beautiful, Layla," Holloway said softly. Layla smiled, a mix of excitement and nerves on her face. "Thanks, Dad," she replied. Then, holding up the shoebox, she added, "I thought maybe we could bring these for luck." Holloway knew without asking what was in the box. The yellow shoes, Layla's last connection to her mother, had become a symbol of their journey together. From a source of pain and loss, they had transformed into a reminder of love and new beginnings. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Holloway said, his voice thick with emotion. The ride to the courthouse was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Holloway's mind raced with memories of the past year, the late-night talks, the tears and laughter, the small triumphs and setbacks that had brought them to this point. As they walked into the courthouse, Holloway felt Layla's small hand slip into his. He gave it a reassuring squeeze, drawing strength from her presence just as much as she drew strength from his. The adoption hearing itself was both overwhelming and surprisingly swift. The judge, a kind-faced woman with graying hair, listened as their caseworker presented their file. She asked Holloway and Layla a few questions, her eyes twinkling as she observed their obvious bond. Finally, she smiled broadly. "Well," she said, "I see no reason why this adoption shouldn't be finalized. Officer Holloway, are you ready to become Layla's legal father, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails?" Holloway felt tears prick at his eyes as he answered, "Yes, Your Honor, more than ready." The judge turned to Layla. "And Layla, are you ready for Officer Holloway to become your legal father?" Layla's voice was clear and strong as she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. He already is in my heart." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as the judge declared, "Then by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby declare this adoption final. Congratulations to you both." The small group of friends and colleagues who had come to support them burst into applause. Holloway knelt down, enveloping Layla in a tight hug. "We did it, sweetheart," he whispered. "We're officially a family now." Layla hugged him back just as tightly. "We were already a family, Dad," she said softly. "This just makes it official." As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright summer day, Holloway felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. The path that had led them here had been winding and often difficult, but every step had been worth it. They walked hand in hand to a nearby park, finding a quiet bench beneath a shady tree. Layla carefully opened the shoebox, revealing the yellow shoes nestled inside. "Mum would be happy, wouldn't she?" Layla asked, her fingers gently tracing the worn leather. Holloway nodded, putting an arm around her shoulders. "I think she'd be very happy," he said. "She'd be so proud of how brave and strong you've been." Layla leaned into him, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I miss her," she said softly, "but I'm glad I have you now too." "And you always will," Holloway promised. "We're in this together, remember?" They sat there for a while, enjoying the peaceful moment. The yellow shoes sat between them, a testament to the journey they'd taken, from loss and grief to hope and new beginnings. As they finally stood to leave, Layla carefully placed the shoes back in the box. "Can we stop for ice cream on the way home?" she asked, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Holloway laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I think that's a great idea. After all, we've got something pretty big to celebrate." Hand in hand, father and daughter walked out of the park, ready to start the next chapter of their lives together. The path ahead was unknown, but they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, one step at a time. Thank you for joining us on this touching journey of healing and unexpected connection. If this story of a police officer and a grieving child finding hope in each other touched your heart, I've handpicked another inspiring tale I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it next.